you mean. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Spitzer, and thanks to the Napa Institute for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you all for coming to hear it. Let me see if the clicker works. Yes, there we go. So, given everything that's happening in our culture, our country, and our world, it's easy to get discouraged. And there's no question that we do face very daunting problems. I'll be discussing one of the most grave and fundamental of those problems, but my message is one of hope, not gloom. The theme of today's session is renewing God's presence in our culture. The underlying reason why our culture is less religious and needs to be renewed is quite simply that a large number of individual people have become less religious or lost their faith altogether. Now, what caused that? Well, there are many reasons, but one of the major causes is that many people have come to the conclusion that believing in God or being religious is contrary to science. One study found that 70% of young adult Catholics view science and religion as being in conflict. Several major studies by Cara, by Pew, have found that the primary reason given by young people for losing their faith is that they think religion and science are incompatible. This isn't a new problem. It has its roots in anti-religious propaganda that started over 200 years ago and that intensified in the late 19th century. There was another wave of this propaganda started about 20 years ago with the rise of the so-called new atheists. But one reason that such propaganda has been so successful in recent decades is that atheists have been pushing on an open door. Religious people have not been telling our side of the story. Young people have not been equipped with the ideas, facts, and arguments that they need to hear on the relation of science and faith. It isn't just that they don't know these facts and arguments. Most of them don't even know that there are any facts and arguments that could be given in response to what they're hearing from the atheists. The first piece of good news is that this is beginning to change. The sleeping giant has at last begun to wake up. There are increasing numbers of Catholic organizations and initiatives that are responding to this problem. Let me just flash a list of a few of them. And what I want you to notice is the dates that these initiatives began. So while we face an enormous task, and there is a lot of work to do, at least the work has started. People are beginning to face up to the problem and to do something about it. The second piece of good news is this. The claim that science and religion are at odds with each other has no solid basis. It is based on fundamental misconceptions about science, religion, and history. And many of these misconceptions are not about subtle issues that require sophisticated arguments or deep scholarship to understand. The major misconceptions are just simple blunders that are fairly easy to explain even to young people, to high school students, even younger students. So let's start with history. A very big part of the reason that so many people think that science and religion are incompatible is that they have a completely false notion of how science and religion have interacted throughout history. They can't be blamed for this. Because they are just accepting a narrative that everyone is taught and almost everyone takes for granted. Until recently, even historians of science generally believed it. This standard narrative says that religious people and institutions have been hostile to science and tried to suppress it or hold it back, that the great founders of science, like Galileo, were rebels against religion, and that for the last 400 years or more, science and religion have been two hostile camps at war with each other. This idea is called by historians of science the conflict thesis or the warfare thesis. And as I said, until recently, even historians of science generally believed it. But here is another piece of good news. Today, historians of science almost unanimously reject this conflict thesis as a myth. They trace this myth to the work of two incompetent amateur historians, both Americans, whose faces I now show you. Rather cheerful fellows, are they not? John William Draper was the author of a book called History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, published in 1874. Andrew Dixon White, who, by the way, was the first president of Cornell University, was the author of a book called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, published in 1896. These two books were enormously popular bestsellers and have been translated into many languages and have remained in print ever since they were written, and they are responsible to a large extent for creating this narrative with which we all have to live. Professional historians now dismiss these books as nearly worthless and filled with gross errors and distortions. The real history is almost the complete opposite of what the conflict thesis says. Science and religion were never two warring camps. A very simple fact shows this. For the first few centuries of modern science, almost all the great scientists were themselves deeply religious. Modern science effectively began in what is called the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries. Here are the leading figures of the scientific revolution. This is a who's who of the scientific revolution. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Pascal, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton. I list more great names on the right side of this slide. These are probably the top 20 scientists of the scientific revolution, and every single one of them was a devout Christian. About half of them Catholic, about half of them Protestant. Not a single one was an atheist. Kepler, for example, wrote a beautiful prayer in one of his scientific treatises. I thank you, Lord God, our Creator, that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work of creation. That was the typical attitude of most scientists. They saw their work as revealing the hidden beauty of God's creation. That remained the attitude of most scientists well into the 19th century. For example, most physicists would tell you that the two greatest physicists of the 19th century were Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell, both deeply devout Christians. And even in our own less religious times, there are still many scientists who are religious, both Catholics and non-Catholics. For example, the Society of Catholic Scientists, which began almost exactly 7 years ago with just 6 members, has already grown to over 2,000 members, about 2/3 of whom have doctorates in a natural science, and most of the rest are graduate students. Moreover, the ranks of religious scientists today include some of the top scientists in the world, and I can't resist telling you about 2 of them to whom the Society of Catholic Scientists gave its St. Albert Award in 2018 and 2023. So Juan Martín Maldacena is at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and made one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of fundamental physics. He is regarded as in the same league with figures such as the late Stephen Hawking. Just to show you that I'm not exaggerating, I list here the top 5 most cited theoretical physics papers of the last 60 years. Hawking's most famous paper is number 5 on this list, the paper that laid the foundation of what is called the Standard Model of Particle Physics, is number 2 in this list. Steven Weinberg won the Nobel Prize for that. The names I have put in blue are in anyone's list of the top 10 theoretical physicists in the last 60 years. And Juan Maldacena, who is at the top of that list, who wrote the most cited paper in the history of theoretical particle physics, is a practicing and believing Catholic and a member of the Society of Catholic Scientists. Steven Weinberg is an atheist. Stephen Hawking was Steven Weinberg was an atheist. He's now deceased, probably a theist at this point. Stephen Hawking was an atheist. Ed Witten, who's number 3 on that list, many physicists, they've done actually, did a survey, and he is voted by most physicists as the most brilliant physicist in the world. Ed Witten is an agnostic, but Juan Maldacena is a practicing Catholic. The other person I want to tell you about is Anthony Ichiro Sanda. In 2004, Tony Sanda won the highest award that the American Physical Society gives for work in theoretical particle physics. In 1997, he won the Nishina Prize, the oldest and most prestigious physics award in Japan. And he has won many other awards for his scientific achievements, including 2 from the Emperor of Japan. Tony Sanda is a devout Catholic and serves as a deacon in the Archdiocese of Tokyo. So I'm now going to tell you a remarkable fact that dramatically illustrates the positive relation that has historically existed between the Catholic Church and science. And that is that there were a remarkable number of Catholic priests who made major scientific discoveries and even founded entire branches of science. So here are 3 that every Catholic should know the names of, and every Catholic high school student should know the names of these 3. The Big Bang Theory, the central pillar of the science of cosmology and our understanding of the universe, was proposed by a Belgian theoretical physicist and a Catholic priest named Georges Lemaitre. A French physicist friend of mine who taught me how to pronounce that. Most people say Lemaitre or Lemaitre, but I'm told that it's something like Lemaitre. The founder of the science of genetics, well, this everyone knows, it was Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian priest. And one of the main founders of the science of geology, if not the founder, was Blessed Nicholas Steno, also known as Niels Stenson. In the 17th century, he made the first great breakthrough in geology, which was to develop the correct theory of the origin of sedimentary rocks, geological strata, and fossils. A recent book on the history of geology calls Steno, quote, the founder of modern geological thought. So 3 branches of science were founded by Catholic priests. There are 3 others. You shouldn't necessarily remember their names, but they were very important. One of the founders, one of the pioneers of astrophysics, was the Jesuit priest Angelo Secchi. He was the first person to classify stars by the spectra of their light, which is one of the fundamental elements of astrophysics. The founders of acoustics, the science of sound, were Galileo and the French Mennonite friar Marin Mersenne. And the founder of crystallography was another French priest, René Just Oy. A lot more could be said about history, but I think I've said enough to show how utterly baseless is the idea that science and religion were historical enemies. It's not only baseless, but the reverse of the truth. It is an idea that has done tremendous damage to religious belief in the modern world, but it is no longer taken seriously by historians of science, and there is reason to hope that as time goes on, fewer and fewer people will be taken in by this myth. But dispelling the myth will take persistent effort by all of us. So let me turn to some other basic mistakes that have led people to think that science and religion are incompatible. One of them is the idea that you have to choose between natural explanations of things and supernatural explanations. God and nature are pitted against each other as competing explanations. So that if something has a natural explanation, then supposedly God has nothing to do with it. And conversely, if God is the cause of something, then supposedly it must be supernatural or miraculous. So many people think it's a zero-sum game, So many people think that to find evidence of God, you must look to what is outside the course of nature or inexplicable by natural explanations or science. That is, to the gaps in our scientific understanding. Hence the expression, the God of the gaps. And atheists think that by closing the gaps in our scientific understanding of nature, they'll leave no place for God to hide. But that is a complete misunderstanding of the way the church has always understood God and his relation to nature. God and nature are not in competition, let alone opposed to each other, because God is the author of nature. And so everything we attribute to nature and to natural causes, we also should attribute to God as the author of nature. This is a very key point. The idea that God is the author of nature, or the author of the universe, goes back to the early church. I could give you many quotes, but I'm sorry, I should have had that slide up. God is the author of nature, but that idea goes back to the early church. And here are three of the great, important theologians and writers of the early church, St. Irenaeus, Minucius Felix, and Origen. And you don't have to read them, but I put in red that they're calling God the author of the universe. The fathers of the church said that God is the author of two books. The Bible, the book of Scripture on the one hand, but the book of nature, or the book of the universe, on the other. And St. Augustine, for example, there are many church fathers spoke on this theme. St. Augustine, for example, wrote, "It is the divine page, that is the Bible, that you must listen to. It is the book of the universe that you must observe. The pages of Scripture can only be read by those who know how to read and write, while everyone, even the illiterate, can read the book of the universe." So let's think about this analogy of the universe being like a book, let's say a novel, with God as its author. Now, just like a novel, the universe has a sequence of events that unfold in some understandable way. A plot. In other words, the universe has a plot, just like a novel, a very complicated plot with many subplots. So let's think about novels and their plots and how we understand what happens in the plot of a novel. Let's be concrete. Let's think of a particular novel, Tolkien's novel, The Hobbit. One event that happens in that book's plot is that a dragon named Smaug is killed by an arrow shot by a character named Barr the Bowman. So I'm going to have a little election here, a little vote. I'm going to ask you, what was the cause of the dragon's death in The Hobbit? Okay? I'll give you two options. Raise your hand if the cause of the dragon's death, if you think the cause of the dragon's death was that it was shot by an arrow by Barr the Bowman. Raise your hands. Okay? I can't see, but... Now, alternatively, raise your hand if you think that the dragon died in The Hobbit because Tolkien wrote the book that way. Okay? Now, we could have done this with a secret ballot, but now, even though this isn't 1960 in Chicago, you should have voted twice. Because both answers are completely true and valid explanations. The cause of the dragon's death within the plot of the novel was being shot by Barr the bowman. But on another level, the cause was Tolkien, because he's the author of the cause of the whole book and of its entire plot. And these two explanations in no way compete with each other. You don't have to reject one to accept the other. You shouldn't. So let's apply the lesson of this little example to the book of the universe. Events within the plot of the universe have causes within the plot of the universe. These are the natural causes of things which we all study every day, and which scientists in particular study in a more disciplined and technical way. Now, in Catholic theology, these causes within the created world are called secondary causes. But God, as author of nature, of the universe, is also the cause of the whole universe and its whole plot. And in traditional terminology, he is called the primary cause, the causa prima. There's no competition between these two causes. Okay? That's why the Church has never seen a contradiction between evolution of species and creation. Did this species of animal, say a giraffe or a hippo or a crocodile, did it arise through a series of natural causes, such as reproduction and evolution, a series of natural causes within the plot of the universe? Or did that species arise because God wrote the script of the universe that way? Both. So saying that you have to choose between natural explanations and God, and therefore between science and religion, is really based on a silly mistake. Now, atheists make another huge mistake. They say that we who believe in God have no evidence for God. Our faith is therefore irrational, unlike science, where we have tons of evidence for things. Now, what kind of evidence for God is the atheist asking for? He's asking for the kind of evidence, the same kind of evidence that we have in physics and in other natural sciences. What physicists and other natural scientists study is the physical universe and its parts. That is, physical entities. Entities that, because they are physical, act as causes within the universe, within the plot of nature. Entities which, therefore, have physical effects upon our sense organs or upon our experimental instruments and devices. But God is not a part of the physical universe and is not a physical entity. And so you cannot see God with a telescope or a microscope or a particle accelerator. Those who are old enough will remember that when the Soviets sent the first cosmonaut into outer space, Yuri Gagarin, Khrushchev announced triumphantly, he didn't see God up there, which is childish, actually, because God is not a physical entity. He's not a part of the universe. But there is another kind of evidence for God, not for God as a part of the universe, but because he isn't, but as author of the universe. Let's go back to the analogy of the novel and its author. Where do you get evidence of the existence of the author of a novel? If you look into the text of The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, for example, you look into the text and the plot of the book, you're not going to see Tolkien there. Tolkien isn't inside the book. He's not a set of words in the text. He's not a character in the book. He's not in Middle-earth. Tolkien is not to be found in Middle-earth. Gandalf and Frodo wandering around in Middle-earth aren't going to bump in one day to Tolkien and say, hey, Tolkien, thank you for creating us. No. So the way you know that there's an author to the book is because the book exists. It exists, it has a certain structure, a form, a certain beauty, a certain harmony, a certain meaning, and that tells you that there had to be a mind behind it. That without a novelist, there wouldn't be a novel. Same with music. I mean, so how do you find Mozart? Do you go into one of his symphonies and poke around among the notes? Do you look at the score of one of his symphonies and, oh, there's Mozart, he's a set of notes here? No, he's not a part of the symphony. He's the author of the symphony. And the symphony, by the fact that it exists, by the fact that it has a certain structure and form and beauty and even meaning, in some cases of some music, tells you that there's a mind that conceives it, there's a composer. You won't have a symphony unless there's a composer. In the same way, the book of the universe points to its author by the fact that it exists and by its order and harmony and beauty and structure and so on. So finally, in the few minutes that remain to me, I want to point out, so those are the sort of crude philosophical mistakes that the atheists make. So in the final few minutes, I want to point out another big mistake the atheists make. They say that the actual discoveries of science have undercut some basic religious beliefs. And indeed, that is how matters looked to many people in the 19th century. The science back then, maybe 120 years ago, 150 years ago, did seem in a number of important ways to clash with traditional religious ideas. But again, there's good news. The good news is that in the 20th century and 21st century, we have discovered that older science was wrong in key respects. So I want to quickly list 5 ways, very fast, that the older science was wrong and that the newer science aligns much better with what we believe by faith. So number 1, the older science seemed to suggest that the world had no beginning. But in 1930, Father Georges Lemaitre proposed the Big Bang theory based on Einstein's theory of gravity. And now the evidence very strongly supports the conclusion that the universe did have a beginning. 2, the older science strongly suggested that the laws of physics determine the future uniquely, leaving no room for free will to operate. This was a huge deal. This actually caused a lot of the loss of faith in Europe in the 18th century, 19th century was due to this. But in the 1920s, quantum mechanics showed that this is not true. The laws of physics do not uniquely determine what is going to happen in the future, and therefore do not rule out the possibility of free will. 3, the older science seemed to say that human beings are just an accident in a universe that clearly was not made with us in mind. But in the last 50 years, it has become apparent that many features of the universe and its laws are just right to make it possible for the universe to have living things in it, to give rise to living things, such as ourselves. This is sometimes called anthropic coincidences. This conclusion was very controversial until quite recently, until I would say the last 25 years or so. But here are 2 quotes by non-religious scientists who I've actually mentioned earlier, showing that this is now actually generally accepted. So Stephen Hawking, who was an atheist, wrote in his last book, "Our universe and its laws appear to have a design that is tailor-made to support us, and if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. That is not easily explained and raises the natural question of why it is that way." Now, I should say, he had the view that there is a natural way to explain this based on something called the multiverse, which I won't get into. Ed Witten, who I mentioned earlier, who is an agnostic, wrote, or actually he said this in an interview, "The fact that galaxies, stars, and planets roughly like ours could have formed, and that living things roughly like us could have formed, depends on many details of the laws of physics as we currently know them, being just the way they are and not being slightly different. I think we'll never resolve the sense of wonder about that." 4, the older science had revealed a universe so vast that it seemed to point to the insignificance of Earth and its inhabitants. But now we know, because of Einstein's theory of gravity, that the universe has to be as that vast, or else it would not have lasted long enough for life, including ourselves, to have been able to arise in it. The universe, it takes billions of years to produce complex living things, such as ourselves. And for a universe to last billions of years, it has to be enormously vast, because Einstein's theory of gravity directly relates time and space and the longevity of the universe to its size. And finally, 20th century physics showed that the laws of physics are based on extremely deep and subtle mathematical ideas, such as the mathematics of quantum mechanics, of quantum field theory, of superstring theory, and so on, suggesting to many that they are the product of a mind. And I actually quote 2 famous physicists. Sir James Jeans, about 100 years ago, or actually a little less, said, "The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine." And Ed Witten, I quote again, he's an agnostic, but in a recent interview he said, "It is as though the universe had been created by a mathematician." Okay, so to sum up, the old idea that science and religion are in conflict is based on outdated science, very poor philosophy, and utterly discredited falsehoods about history. The facts and arguments are on our side. So what do we need now, which is the theme of the conference? We need to get the word out. And everyone can play a role in that. And I'll close by just plugging the website of the Society. There are many good places to go. The Magis Center, the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. But I'm going to plug our website, the Society of Catholic Scientists website, which has a great deal of information that will be helpful. If you have high school-age children, college-age children, or you know people who do, send them to our website, because we have a lot of good information there and educational material that will be very helpful to them. And I have some flyers about the Society of Catholic Scientists on the table down here. If you want to learn more about us, just pick up these little flyers, and you can find out what we're all about. Thank you very much.